Good day. I believe you are doing fine, just like I am also fine. By the grace of God, we are alive, and today I want us to continue our lesson on what church to attend. So now we are talking about the church during the Reformation period. Last time we talked about the church during the Reformation period. So the Reformation is about making changes to something in order to make it more better. And so there was a particular time when some people started reasoning and they proposed a change to some of the practices of the Catholic Church. And last time we talked about some of these people who were major forces in the Reformation period. Today we will continue with the Reformation period and we'll talk about some of the other people who were also major forces of the Reformation period. So on our previous meeting, we talked about someone like John Wycliffe. So John Wycliffe was a major force of the Reformation period. But because of his contribution to the Reformation period, history says that when John Wycliffe died, his bones were being exhumed and they were burned once again. Why? Because what he did was John Wycliffe translated the Bible into English language. And because of what John Wycliffe did, he was considered as an enemy, as a heretic. So even after his death, for so many years after that, his bones were exhumed and they were burned. So we talk about John Wycliffe. We also talk about someone like John Hus. So we also talk about John Hus. And we talk about some groups like the Waldensians. We also talk about some groups like the Arbigins. All these people and groups made a contribution to the Reformation period. So Reformation means they wanted to make changes to the practices of the Catholic Church at that time. Today, we will continue with the Reformation period. Today, we'll start with a man called Martin Luther. Martin Luther. Probably you've heard of Martin Luther before. Martin Luther was born in 1483, November 10th, in Germany. When Martin Luther was born, the father initially was a farmer, but he was not getting enough income from the farming. And so he decided to go into copper mining. So when the father went into copper mining, one of the wish of the father was for Luther to become a lawyer. But history says that there was a time when Luther encountered some natural disaster. In fact, it was a thunderstorm. And because of the terrifying nature, history says that Luther promised himself that when he is saved from that disaster, in fact, he would go ahead to worship God. And history says that apart from that, Luther also had the opportunity to read the Bible. So because of these two major incidents in his life, Luther decided to go into a preaching school. So he entered into the monastery at the age of 21. And that was contrary to the wish of the father. The father wanted Luther to become a lawyer. So when Luther entered into the monastery school, so now he wanted to learn theology. He wanted to become a preacher in the Roman Catholic Church. So in the year 1508 AD, Luther became a preacher in a Roman Catholic Church in a place called Wittenberg in Germany. Then at the same time, he was also a professor who was teaching in the university. Now, one of the beliefs of Martin Luther during his profession was that he regarded the Bible as the sole authority, contrary to what some people thought, that it was the Pope who was the sole authority. History says that Martin Luther held onto the Bible as the sole authority. And because of that belief, because of that stance, Martin Luther was hated and he was branded as a heretic. Before even I continue, remember that all this history that I am giving, I am not the one who implemented them. This history can be found in books. When you Google them, at least you get some pieces of this information. And so this history have been published, and I have some of the copies in order to also read them. And so I did not implement this historical fact. I read them, and that is why I'm also able to present them for you to be able to know. So when Luther was considered as a heretic, now there was a time when Luther challenged the Roman Catholic Church, and the practices that he challenged was indulgence. Indulgence was about the fact that if someone commits a sin and the person offers something, maybe money, then that person can be pardoned for the sins that he or she committed. That is, the person would not face the consequences of the sin that he or she committed. So Luther was against indulgence. Apart from indulgence, Luther was against other practices of the Roman Catholic Church. Remember, when Luther went to the monastery school, after he graduated from the school, he became a priest in the Roman Catholic Church. So he was serving under the authorities of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, when Luther was against some of the practices of the Roman Catholic Church, history says that there was a time when he wrote 95 theses. 95 theses. Then he posted the theses on the door of the church where he served as a priest. And then he challenged the Roman Catholic authorities that whoever wanted to debate him, that person can come forward. In the 95 theses, Luther challenged some of the practices of the Roman Catholic Church. Because of what Martin Luther did, history says that in the year 1518, Martin Luther translated again the 95 theses from Latin into Germany. In fact, initially he wrote it in Latin. So in the year 1518, he translated it from Latin into Germany in order to make it available for many people to read, because he served as a priest in a Roman Catholic church in Germany. And so in order to make it easy for most of the people to read the thesis, he translated it into Germany. And that action that he took made the thesis to get a wider impact, because most of the people were able to speak and listen and hear the German language. So because of what Luther did, history says that in the year 1518, Luther was summoned to Rome by the Roman Catholic authorities because of what he did. But then there was a particular man who was called Frederick III of Saxony. Frederick III of Saxony. This man happens to be someone who was significant in the Roman Empire. And so, for some reasons, he loved Martin Luther. And because of that, when Luther was summoned to Rome in order to answer questions on the 95 theses, Frederick intervened. And because of that intervention, the case was moved into Germany. Now, when the time was up for the authorities of the Roman Catholic Church to meet Luther, when they met, that meeting, they call it the Diet. Diet, D-I-E-T, Diet. And during that meeting, Luther was questioned on the 95 theses. In fact, for some reasons, he was pressured to retract most of the things that he said in the 95 theses. He decided not to retract all the things that he said in the 95 theses. And because of that, in the year 1520, now the Roman Catholic authorities now issued a letter, and that letter, we call it the Papal Bull. The Papal Bull. In that letter, Luther was threatened with excommunication, that unless he recounts at least 41 of the 95 theses, or he retracts at least 41 of the 95 theses. Unless he does that, then he will be excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church. So excommunication means that now he will be sent away. He will not be allowed to worship with the church. He will not be allowed to do anything in the church. He will not be part of even the church organization. So history says that Luther was threatened with excommunication. But then, in the year 1520, the same year that they sent the letter where he was threatened with excommunication, in that same year, history says that in the letter, Luther was given at least 60 days in order to retract at least 41 out of the 95 theses. And when Luther received the letter, he waited for the 60 days to expire. After the 60 days expired, what he did was he threw the letter in a fire and he burned it. So what he did was a challenge to the Roman Catholic authorities. Because this time he challenged the authority to be able to even burn a letter that they sent to him, that they use it to summon him, or they use it to warn him to retract most of the things he said in the 95 theses, or they use it to threaten him with excommunication. And Luther burned that letter, and that is a challenge to the authority. So when the authorities heard what Martin Luther did, now what they did was they issued another letter, which we call it the papal bull. Papal bull. So when another letter was issued, this time Luther was excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church, and he was considered as a heretic. So heretic, someone who is spreading false information. Now, when Luther was considered as a heretic, it means that this time now he will no longer be allowed to serve as a priest in the church where he was preaching. He was banned from preaching. He was banned from taking part in any of the sacraments in the church. So Luther was excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church. In that same year, the Roman emperor at that time, who was called Charles V. So Charles V was a Roman emperor. In fact, history calls him Holy Roman Emperor. Holy means that he loved the Roman Catholic Church. He loved to defend the Roman Catholic Church. And so history says that Holy Roman Emperor, which is Charles V, what he did was that he imposed a ban on Martin Luther. Remember, when we started this lesson, Church of Christ, that started in the book of Acts chapter 2. Gradually, it changed into Roman Catholic Church. Why? Because Church of Christ was absorbed into the Roman Empire as a result of Emperor Constantine. Constantine developed love for Christianity. And so when Constantine gave freedom for the Christians to be able to worship, gradually the church became a state religion. And so now the church was part of the Roman Empire. And because of that, as I said previously in one of the lessons, whenever anyone opposes the church or the Roman Catholic Church, that is the Church of Christ, that gradually turned into the Roman Catholic Church. Whenever anyone opposes them, that person was considered as a heretic. And when you are considered as a heretic, it means that you have committed a crime against the Catholic Church. At the same time, you have committed a crime against the state, because the church was now part of the state. So when Charles V heard what Martin Luther did, even though he was a Roman emperor, but because at that time the church was part of the Roman Empire, the church had become a state religion, he also issued a ban against Luther. And in that ban, Luther was considered as someone who was an outlaw. In fact, Most of the works that he did, he could not print them, he could not distribute them. In fact, the worst part of it is that anyone could even kill him without any reprisal. So Martin Luther was considered an outlaw. Because of that ban that was imposed on him. Now, again, this man intervened, Frederick III of Saxony. Again, he intervened. What he did was that he arranged for a kidnap of Martin Luther. And that kidnap was a fake kidnap because the intention was to protect Martin Luther. So he arranged for people to kidnap Martin Luther. And Martin Luther was taken to a secured place where he would be safe. Because remember, Charles V has imposed a ban on him to the extent that anyone who sees Luther could even kill him without reprisal. So he needed a safe place. And so Luther was taken to a safe place. Now, whilst Luther was hiding in the safe place, as a result of Frederick III of Saxony, who developed love for Martin Luther. As a result of that, history says that whilst he was hiding, Luther translated the Bible, in fact, the New Testament Bible. He translated it from Greek into German language so that the Germans or people who were able to speak and read and write the German language can also understand the Bible. At the same time, there was a particular man who was called William Tyndale. This man also translated the New Testament Bible from Greek into English. And history says that he wanted to print the books in England, but then the church prevented him from doing so. And so because of that, he printed the books in Germany. He went to Germany to print the books because he was being opposed by the Catholic authorities. So he weren't able to print the books in England. Now, William Tyndale, after he translated the Bible, the New Testament Bible, into English from Greek, history says that he decided to again translate the Old Testament Bible also into English language in the year 1526. But on the process, he was captured and he was tried as a heresy and he was burned as stick. Remember, in a previous lesson, anyone who is considered as a heretic, the punishment is that you have to be burned as stick. You have to be burned. But for Luther, he was not burned as stick because of his popularity. And again, because of Frederick III of Saxony, who mostly intervened for Martin Luther. And so because of that, he was not burned as stick. In fact, history says that Luther died out of severe illness. So Martin Luther opposed the Catholic authorities. Now, history says that in the year 1525, what Martin Luther did was that he decided to marry and he broke away from the Catholic protocol because one of the requirements to be a priest in the Catholic Church is to be a celibate, to practice celibacy. But because Luther challenged the practices of the Catholic Church at that time, he went further to marry. And by marrying, now he even challenged them even more further. So Luther, at that time, he was even considered as someone who has been excommunicated. In fact, he was even banned from the church. And so he had the authority to even marry that time. So in the year 1525, he went further to marry and he had children. And history says that Luther died in the year 1546 and he was buried in Wittenberg in Germany. So Martin Luther made a major contribution to Reformation. At the same time, when he translated the New Testament Bible into the German language, at the same time, that is when another man called William Tyndale also translated the New Testament from Greek into the English language. But then, William Tyndale was tried as a heretic he was burned at stake. And Luther also died out of natural illness. So up to this point, I have talked about two people who made a contribution to Reformation. Now, as a result of what Martin Luther did, as a result of the 95 Theses and his contribution to Reformation, there were certain people who decided to join Martin Luther. And so those people, what they did was they formed a church and they call it Lutheran Church. So some people broke out of the Catholic Church and they call themselves the Lutheran Church. But interestingly, when you read history, Martin Luther himself told them that they should not use his name as the name of the church, but rather they should just call themselves Christians. But they did not listen. So they formed their own church and they call it the Lutheran Church. So we had the Lutheran Church as a result of Martin Luther, who opposed the Roman Catholic authorities. Apart from that, there was another man who was called Ulrich Zwingli. Ulrich Zwingli. Ulrich Zwingli also lived from 1484 to 1564 AD. This man lived in Switzerland, and he also operated at the same time as Martin Luther. He was also a major reformer. He contributed to Reformation. In fact, history says that this man was killed in a battle by Catholic authorities. So Ulrich Zwingli also contributed to Reformation, but he was killed by Catholic soldiers in a war or in a battle. Apart from Ulrich Zwingli, there was also another man called John Calvin. So John Calvin, in the year 1509 to 1564, John Calvin was also born in France. And history says that after Ulrich Zwingli died, it was John Calvin who succeeded him in Switzerland. So he also promoted the same doctrines or the same argument for Ulrich Zwingli. And history says that John Calvin also promoted some doctrines such as predestination, such as some particular redemption. So when we talk about redemption, he had a particular way of talking about it. And then another doctrine such as the irresistible grace or perseverance of the saints, meaning that once you become a Christian, you are always saved. It doesn't matter what you do, you are always saved. So they call it once saved, always saved. So John Calvin also promoted such doctrines. Now, after John Calvin, there was a particular man who was called John Knox. John Knox. So John Knox also promoted John Calvin's doctrines, and he also went to Scotland and he established the Presbyterian Church. And so that is how we got the Presbyterian Church. So it was founded by John Knox, and most of the doctrines are from John Calvin, and it was founded by John Knox. So the word Presbyterian is coming from the Greek word presbyteros. Presbyteros. And that presbyteros means that elder. It means elder. So presbyteros means elder. And it means that a church which is being governed by elders. So that is the literal meaning of Presbyterian Church. It means a church being governed by elders. So John Knox also formed Presbyterian Church, and that is how we got Presbyterian Church. Apart from that, now later on, there was a confusion about baptism. So people decided to also form their own church, and that is how we got Baptist Church. Baptist Church. In fact, initially they called themselves Anabaptists, meaning that anyone who broke out from the Catholic Church had to be rebaptized again. Then, if you did not allow yourself to be rebaptized again, then they would not allow you to join their group. So the idea of rebaptizing again after you break out from the Catholic Church, they gave themselves the name Anabaptists. So later on, they were called Baptist Church. And so that is how we had Baptist Church. Then King Henry VII also had the Church of England, the Church of England, or the Episcopal Church, the Episcopal Church. So we had the Church of England, or the Episcopal Church, also headed by King Henry VII. Then apart from that, history also says that John Wesley, who was initially part of the Church of England, but then there was a time when John Wesley and some other group decided to scrutinize the practices of the Church of England. In fact, one thing that they realized was that they saw that when we talk about spirituality, the Church of England spirituality was not to their expectation. And so they decided to also break away to form their own church. And that is how we had the Methodist Church. So the Methodist Church, which is being headed by John Wesley, is as a result of when he broke away from the Church of England. And so we also had the Methodist Church. And in fact, most of the churches that we see today are as a result of divisions that kept on occurring. Divisions that kept on occurring. So if I want to talk about many churches, in fact, we will not have the time to do so. So today I will end here with the Reformation period. God willing, next time, now we will begin another session of church history called the Restoration period. The Restoration period. And Restoration period, now gradually we are getting to how now the Church of Christ that we know, which started in the book of Acts chapter 2, was again restored back to its original place. So remember that the Church of Christ that started in the book of Acts chapter 2, because men became disobedient, they allow paganism in the church. So gradually, the church practices were changed. Gradually, the church became a state religion. Gradually, the church changed completely into Roman Catholic Church. And because many people oppose the practices of the Roman Catholic Church, now there were so many divisions. And because of those divisions, we had so many denominations also. And today we have thousands and several denominations that we cannot even give account to the number of denominations that we have. It is all because of Church of Christ, which fell from the beginning. And that was how we had most of these denominations that we see today. So because of time, we will not talk about all the denominations. At least we have talked about some of the major ones. So God willing, we will talk about the Restoration period. The Restoration period. God willing, next time when we meet. All right. Until we meet again. Bye-bye.